I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the work that Futerra's done and my sort of take on this whole kind of engagement and creative engagement of people around climate change. And how we try and make sense of the big challenges, how we create visions of the possible, and we sort of touched on that in Simon's talk. How do we kind of expound on positive visions of where we might be going, and to reflect on the now and how we got into this mess in the first place. And for me, a lot of this comes from this Thomas Mann quote about art being to the community what the dream is to the individual. You know, if we're going to have imagination about what solving climate change will look like, then we need to use art and cultural engagement to create those positive visions. Because let's face it, the media are not doing it very effectively at the moment. And it's very difficult to understand what a climate change adapted and mitigated world might look like. What are we running towards rather than what are we running away from? And I suspect, and certainly the evidence would suggest, that we'll run towards a positive vision of a future with more energy and with more stamina, with more vigour, than we'll run away from an apocalyptic vision of a nightmare future. And that's very much been the kind of philosophy which has informed and inspired Futerra's approach over the last 8 years. And I've co-founded Futerra in 2001. And what we set ourselves up to do was to create the right knowledge around sustainability, to challenge the accepted beliefs about the way it should be communicated, and ultimately to inspire people to take action. And in doing so, we've done enormous amounts of research about trying to understand the psychology of attitude and behaviour change. We've produced a number of different thought leadership documents which help people frame the way that these issues need to be communicated if tangible behaviour change is going to result. And some of the latest ones there, I mean, the one in the bottom left is the original 10 rules of communicating sustainability, and these are all downloadable from our website. And the more recent one we did the end of last year was the Greenwash Guide, which was trying to unpick the way that advertising and marketing was basically using slightly distrustful communication around the green credentials of some of its products. And if you want to kind of have a very brief insight into how Futerra works, and this is actually in Mandarin from a Chinese publication, but essentially it's think tank, plan tank, do tank. We try to challenge the established practices of communication. We deliver the big strategies which help people realise those challenges, and we do the implementation on the ground. And if you like, we're actually in a bit of a double trouble bind at the moment collectively. And everyone's talking about the credit crunch and the problems around the financial meltdown that we're facing. But in actual fact, you can draw some very close parallels in terms of ecological capital. Now, in my opinion, actually, I think a lot of the financial system has actually been exposed as the emperor wearing no clothes. You know, it's a lot of the kind of things that you suspected were probably going on have now turned out to be true. And if you take short selling, for example, you know, this speculation on declining share prices, I always thought that in any other walk of life, if you sold something which didn't belong to you, it was called theft. But this seems to be a perfectly legitimate way of making money through the derivatives markets. And if you like, we've built an economy based on consumption and inflated property prices. And if you look at the kind of parallels with the financial world, what's going on here is the fact that in terms of ecology, we're actually depleting our capital. We're not living off the interest of what the ecological systems that support us give us. We're actually depleting the capital. So we're actually undermining the kind of carrying capacity of the planet to support us. And if you like, there's a direct connection here with the toxic debt we sort of talk about in terms of the financial models. And is it all over? So are we actually in such a mess that we're never going to get out of this? And, you know, I'm actually an optimist. I believe that groundless hope, like unconditional love, is the only type worth having. I don't yet hear the fat ladies singing. And I believe everything is possible. And I think what's happening in America is actually incredibly inspiring. And it's easy to sort of fall into that cheesy trap and go into Obama mania. But if you look at what he's already announced in the first week of office, it's really quite dramatic. So he's talking about bringing in the much needed emissions controls on vehicles. He's talking about a smart energy grid for the US. He's talking about doubling the renewable energy capacity in the next 3 years. And that's in the first 7 days of the administration. So what we're seeing is a complete U-turn, if you like, on US policy and around a lot of environmental challenges. And I hope I'm not the only person who noticed that he nicked his strapline from Bob the Builder. So watch this space for David Cameron sounding like Postman Pat when it comes down to the election next year. And as well as this kind of political commitment, we've also seen this huge upsurge in populist, faddish environmentalism. Every single lifestyle magazine around seems to have done some kind of green special or green feature. And it kind of responds to this question of, can we afford to go green in a credit crunch? And the argument has to be, can we afford not to? And actually the smart thinking and the smart money is how we combine those two challenges together. How you rebuild and reinvigorate the economy, thinking about challenges in a different way, which also helps us solve some of our environmental challenges. And it's not like we haven't seen this coming. If you just want to look at the trend in underwear in terms of the kind of increasing evidence of global warming, all the way through from the kind of rather large Victorian knickerbocker to what my Scottish flatmate used to quaintly refer to as the eye patch, you can see that there's a kind of a really clear trend here. And I want to sort of touch on the work that Simon was talking about initially, because we have known about this for a long time. And I want to kind of cross-reference this with growing global population, which hopefully brings us into a sense of where we are now. So carbon dioxide was actually discovered, the main greenhouse gas, was actually discovered by Joseph Black in 1753. And it was only 75 years later where the first guy actually postulated the theory of global warming and the greenhouse effect that Simon talked about. And it was this French guy called Jean-Baptiste Fourier. And he said, actually, the reason that the Earth is habitable is because we have this insulatory layer of gases around us, this carbon dioxide and the other gases which trap the heat in. And that's what makes it such a hospitable place. It was about another 70 years, though, before this very stern-looking Swedish gentleman, Sven Arrhenius, those of you who did GCSE physics will remember from the Arrhenius equation. I can't remember what the hell that is, I just remember the name of it. But what he said was that if we burn the fossil fuels that we have in the Earth's crust, then we're probably going to increase the temperature of the planet. So this is in 1896. So well over 100 years ago, people were already starting to put two and two together and say, hang on, climate change is quite likely. This is what's going to happen if we carry on with what we're doing. And to put this into context, in 1900, the population of the world was 1.6 billion. But just 100 years ago, we're about a quarter of the population of where we are now. And if you look at the way these two trends start to align, in the early 20s, this is another American physicist called Alfred Lotka, and he said, actually, if we burn the coal that we're starting to extract in the US, we're going to change the climate. And again, he's publishing papers raising concerns about forthcoming climate change. Then we come into the 1950s, and when you hit the 50s, the population has grown to 2.5 billion. So there are 1 billion more people on the planet in 50 years, and we're starting to see the first kind of forages into climate modelling. So how can we start to unpick these anthropogenic influences from the natural background complexity of climate change that Simon talked about, all the other factors such as solar radiation, the albedo effect of cloud and ice cap cover, etc. And this is what a computer looked like in the 60s. So the size of a room in order to do some fairly basic calculations. But they started to do the first climate modelling at this time. Then in 1969, and Al Gore talks about this in An Inconvenient Truth, we had this first iconic image of Earthrise, which if you like is the kind of the birth of the real environmental art movement and arguably the wider environmental movement itself. Because suddenly you have this image of a very vulnerable, fragile blue planet, sort of alone in space, where life starts to look a bit of an accident rather than a representation of what else might be out there. And it's incredibly inspiring and drove people to have this sense of conservation about the precious resource that we had.